year was 1603, and behind the gilded walls of Richmond Palace, something unspeakable was happening. In chambers where kings had dined and queens had danced, where treaties had been signed and empires had been born, the most powerful woman in the world was slowly rotting alive. The stench that seeped through marble corridors and silk tapestries was not the familiar scent of court perfumes or burning candles. It was the unmistakable smell of death taking its time. Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen who had transformed a small island nation into a global empire, was experiencing a demise so horrific that those who witnessed it would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget what they had seen. This was not the peaceful passing of a beloved monarch surrounded by tearful subjects. This was something far more sinister, a slow-motion catastrophe that had been building for decades, hidden beneath layers of white paint and royal ceremony. The woman who had stared down the Spanish Armada, who had outmaneuvered kings and popes with the cunning of a master chess player, who had ruled England for 45 years with an iron will that terrified her enemies, was about to face the one opponent she could never defeat. Her own body had become her executioner, and the very tools she had used to project eternal youth and power were now consuming her from the inside out. To understand the full horror of what transpired in those final weeks of winter 1603, we must first comprehend the elaborate deception that Elizabeth had been maintaining for nearly half a century. The iconic image of the Virgin Queen, with her pale porcelain skin and regal bearing, was not a gift of nature. It was a carefully constructed illusion, painted daily with substances so toxic that they would have killed a lesser person in months rather than decades. Every morning for over 40 years, Elizabeth had transformed herself into a living statue. The ghostly white complexion that became her trademark was achieved through the application of ceruse of Venice, a cosmetic paste made from lead carbonate and vinegar. This deadly concoction was applied in layers so thick that her face resembled a mask more than human skin. The lead seeped through her pores, accumulating in her bones and organs like a slow-acting poison, building toward a reckoning that would come with compound interest. But lead was not her only tormentor. In her youth, Elizabeth had survived smallpox, a disease that left her face scarred and her vanity wounded. To combat these imperfections, court physicians prescribed mercury-based treatments, rubbing the liquid metal into her skin with the confidence of men who understood nothing about the substances they wielded. Mercury, they believed, would heal what smallpox had damaged. Instead, it joined forces with the lead already coursing through her system, creating a toxic alliance that would wage war on her body for the rest of her life. The transformation was gradual, invisible to those who saw her daily, but devastating in its cumulative effect. Elizabeth's hair began to thin and fall out in patches, forcing her to rely on increasingly elaborate wigs. Her teeth blackened and rotted, classic symptoms of heavy metal poisoning that she disguised by speaking with her hand strategically placed over her mouth. Her skin, despite the daily application of lead paint, developed a network of sores and discolorations that required ever thicker layers of makeup to conceal. Yet perhaps the most insidious aspect of this slow poisoning was how it affected her mind. Lead and mercury are neurotoxins, substances that gradually erode cognitive function and emotional stability. The sharp, calculating intelligence that had made Elizabeth such a formidable ruler began to show cracks. She experienced periods of confusion, moments when she would forget where she was or speak to people who were not there. These episodes were carefully hidden from public view, managed by a court that understood the catastrophic consequences of revealing weakness in their sovereign. The political implications of Elizabeth's declining health extended far beyond her personal suffering. For her entire reign, she had refused to name an heir, understanding that doing so would immediately weaken her authority, as ambitious nobles began courting her successor. This strategy had served her well for decades, but as her body began its final rebellion, the question of succession became urgent. Behind closed doors, members of the Privy Council whispered anxiously about what would happen if the Queen died without clearly designating a replacement. The crisis deepened in February 1603 with the death of Catherine Howard, Countess of Nottingham, who had been Elizabeth's closest friend and confidant. As Catherine lay dying, she confessed to a secret that would shatter what remained of Elizabeth's emotional stability. Years earlier, she had intercepted a letter from Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, written before his execution for treason. In that letter, Essex had desperately begged the Queen for forgiveness, pleading for mercy that might have saved his life. Elizabeth had never received that letter. She had ordered the execution of the man she loved, believing he had shown no remorse, no recognition of his mistakes, no desire for reconciliation. The revelation that Essex had indeed sought her forgiveness, that his final act had been one of love rather than defiance, destroyed something fundamental in Elizabeth's psyche. The carefully constructed emotional armor that had protected her through decades of political warfare finally cracked beyond repair. The change was immediate and terrifying. Elizabeth, who had always maintained rigid control over her emotions and appetites, began refusing food. She would stand motionless for hours, staring into space with eyes that seemed to see beyond the physical world. When she did speak, it was often to ask the same haunting question over and over. Must I depart? Must I depart? Her voice, once commanding enough to silence Parliament, had become barely audible, the whisper of someone already halfway between life and death. And court physicians, led by Dr. John Dee, recognized the signs of advanced poisoning but felt powerless to reverse damage that had been accumulating for decades. The lead in her system had likely caused kidney failure and severe liver damage. The mercury had compromised her immune system and was eating away at her neurological function. Her skin, the canvas on which she had painted her public image, was beginning to break down in ways that no amount of makeup could disguise. Open sores appeared across her body, weeping fluids that stained her elaborate gowns. Her mouth began to swell grotesquely, making speech increasingly difficult and eating nearly impossible. From her body emanated a foul odor that grew stronger by the day, a smell so offensive that even her most loyal attendants struggled to remain in her presence. The perfumes and incense that had always filled her chambers were no longer sufficient to mask the stench of a body consuming itself from within. By March, Elizabeth's condition had deteriorated beyond anything her court had ever witnessed. She developed a severe abscess in her throat that made swallowing agony and breathing a laborious struggle. The sound of her rasping breath could be heard through closed doors, a harsh rhythm that served as a constant reminder of mortality in a palace that had always celebrated eternal royal authority. Her skin had taken on a greyish pallor that no amount of white lead paint could improve, and her once bright eyes had begun to sink into flesh that seemed to be collapsing inward. Yet the most disturbing aspect of Elizabeth's decline was not the physical symptoms themselves, but her absolute refusal to surrender to them. The woman who had spent her entire reign controlling every detail of her public image was not about to allow death to rob her of that final authority. When her ladies-in-waiting suggested she might be more comfortable in bed, Elizabeth refused with a clarity that was both admirable and heartbreaking. "If I lie down," she said, her voice barely audible through swollen lips, "I shall never rise again." And so she remained upright, seated on cushions placed directly on the floor, clinging to consciousness through sheer force of will. For 4 days and nights, she maintained this vigil, her body failing around her, while her mind fought to maintain the illusion of control that had defined her existence. The cushions beneath her became soaked with fluids leaking from her deteriorating form, creating a scene so grotesque that even hardened courtiers struggled to witness it without revulsion. Those who had known Elizabeth in her prime watched in horror as the most powerful woman in the world was reduced to a figure of profound tragedy. Her jeweled rings had to be removed as her fingers swelled beyond recognition. Her elaborate wigs, could no longer disguise the fact that most of her hair had fallen out entirely. The white makeup that had been her trademark now served only to highlight the network of black veins that had appeared across her face. A roadmap of the poison that was claiming her life inch by inch. Robert Carey, Elizabeth's nephew, left detailed accounts of these final days that paint a picture of a woman caught between two worlds. At moments, she would display flashes of her old intelligence, her eyes sharp with recognition as she observed the political maneuvering taking place around her deathbed. At other times, she would drift into a childlike state, her finger resting in her mouth as she mumbled fragments of memory and regret. Essex, she would whisper sometimes, the name of the man whose death had precipitated her final collapse. At other moments, she would return to that haunting refrain. Must I depart? The question seemed to embody her entire relationship with mortality, a challenge thrown in the face of a universe that dared to impose limits on royal authority. The political machinery of the kingdom continued to function around this scene of decay, but with increasing urgency. Robert Cecil, her Secretary of State, knew that the Queen's death without a clear succession plan could plunge England into civil war. Foreign powers watched with interest, ready to exploit any weakness in English resolve. The Spanish, still smarting from their naval defeat decades earlier, would welcome chaos in their old enemy's homeland. The courtiers who gathered in hushed circles throughout Richmond Palace understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented in English history. This was not merely the death of a monarch, but the complete dissolution of a carefully maintained illusion that had sustained the realm for nearly half a century. The Virgin Queen, who had transformed her very body into a symbol of national power, was experiencing the ultimate betrayal as that same body turned against everything she represented. As March progressed, the symptoms that had been confined to Elizabeth's private chambers began to manifest in ways that could no longer be hidden from the broader court. The abscess in her throat had grown so large that her speech became virtually unintelligible, forcing her to communicate through gestures and written notes that her trembling hands could barely manage. The swelling had spread to her face, distorting her features so dramatically that visitors who had not seen her in weeks struggled to recognize the woman who had once been considered one of the most beautiful monarchs in Europe. The toxic accumulation of decades was now expressing itself in ways that defied the understanding of Tudor medicine. Elizabeth's skin had begun to take on an almost translucent quality, revealing the dark network of veins beneath. Where the lead-based cosmetics had been applied most heavily, particularly around her eyes and mouth, the flesh had started to break down entirely, creating wounds that wept constantly and refused to heal. The mercury that had seeped into her system over the years was now causing her hands to shake uncontrollably, making even the simple act of holding a cup impossible without assistance. Dr. John Dee and his fellow physicians found themselves confronting a medical mystery that challenged everything they thought they understood about the human body. The Queen's symptoms did not align with any known disease or condition. Her organs were failing in sequence, yet she remained conscious and aware, trapped inside a form that was systematically destroying itself. They applied leeches to draw out what they believed to be corrupted blood, administered purgatives to cleanse her system, and even attempted primitive forms of surgery to drain the abscesses, but nothing could halt the relentless progression of her decline. What made the situation even more horrifying was Elizabeth's continued mental acuity during periods when the pain subsided. She remained fully aware of what was happening to her body, understanding with crystalline clarity that she was experiencing the consequences of choices made decades earlier in pursuit of an image that had seemed worth any price. The cosmetics that had made her immortal in portraits were revealing themselves to be instruments of a slow and agonizing death. The practical challenges of caring for the dying queen created unprecedented problems for her attendants. Lady Southwell and the other ladies in waiting found themselves dealing with bodily functions that had completely broken down. Elizabeth's bladder and bowels had lost all control, requiring constant changes of bedding and clothing that became increasingly difficult as her body swelled and her skin became more fragile. The odor that emanated from her person was so overwhelming that servants began burning aromatic herbs around the clock, filling the royal chambers with smoke that provided only minimal relief from the stench of decay. Yet even as her physical form betrayed her, Elizabeth maintained her psychological grip on power through sheer force of personality. She refused to allow anyone to make decisions about her care without her explicit approval, insisting on being consulted about everything from the timing of medical treatments to the scheduling of court business. When visitors came to pay their respects, she demanded to be painted and dressed in her full regalia, despite the agony that this process caused her deteriorating body. The elaborate ritual of preparing Elizabeth for these audiences became a daily exercise in collective denial. Her ladies would spend hours applying layers of the same lead-based makeup that was killing her, knowing that each application added to her suffering, but understanding that the alternative, allowing anyone to see her true condition, was unthinkable. Wigs were carefully positioned to hide her baldness, jewels were strategically placed to distract from her swollen features, and her gowns were modified to accommodate the grotesque changes in her body shape. These preparations took on an almost theatrical quality, as if the entire court was participating in an elaborate performance designed to maintain the fiction of royal immortality. The Queen who appeared at these brief audiences bore little resemblance to the woman who lay gasping and moaning in her private chambers, yet the illusion was maintained with desperate dedication by everyone involved. They understood instinctively that the moment Elizabeth's true condition became widely known, the carefully balanced political structure of the kingdom would begin to collapse. The international implications of Elizabeth's condition were not lost on the more astute members of her council. Foreign ambassadors had begun sending increasingly urgent dispatches to their home courts, reporting strange delays in diplomatic meetings and unusual restrictions on access to the Queen. The Spanish ambassador noted in his correspondence that Elizabeth had not been seen in public for over a month, and that when she did appear, she seemed to require unusual amounts of assistance simply to remain upright. These reports triggered a flurry of activity in the courts of Europe, where Elizabeth's death was seen as potentially opening new opportunities for expansion or conquest. The French began quietly positioning troops near their northern borders, while the Spanish renewed their claims to English territories. Catholic powers saw the approaching end of Protestant rule in England as a divine opportunity to restore the true faith to a kingdom that had been led astray by heretical monarchs. Within England itself, the uncertainty surrounding Elizabeth's condition created a dangerous vacuum of authority. Local magistrates found themselves making decisions without clear guidance from the central government, while military commanders struggled with questions about their ultimate loyalty if the Queen should die without naming a successor. The very efficiency of Elizabeth's autocratic rule, which had been one of her greatest strengths, now became a liability, as the entire system depended on a single individual who was clearly failing. Robert Cecil worked tirelessly to maintain the appearance of normal governance while privately preparing for every possible contingency. He drafted letters to James VI of Scotland, carefully worded to suggest support for his claim to the English throne without explicitly committing treason against the still living Elizabeth. He also began consolidating control over key military installations and treasury funds, understanding that the transition period following Elizabeth's death would be fraught with danger and opportunity in equal measure. The Queen herself seemed to understand the precarious nature of the situation, despite her physical suffering. During her more lucid moments, she would quiz Cecil and other advisors about the state of the realm, demanding detailed reports on everything from tax collections to military readiness. She remained obsessed with maintaining control over information, insisting that no official announcements be made about her health and threatening severe punishment for anyone who spread rumors about her condition. This obsession with secrecy extended to her medical care, where Elizabeth insisted on approving every treatment and medication before it was administered. She had developed a deep distrust of her physicians, perhaps understanding on some level that their remedies were as likely to harm as help. When they suggested more aggressive treatments, including the possibility of surgery to drain the larger abscesses, she refused with a vehemence that surprised even those who knew her well. The Queen's refusal to accept conventional medical intervention reflected her growing awareness that her condition was beyond the help of Tudor medicine. She had begun to speak of her illness in terms that suggested she understood its true nature, not as a sudden disease that might be cured, but as the inevitable result of decades of accumulated damage. In her more philosophical moments, she would refer to her body as a house that had been slowly undermined by its own foundations, a structure that could no longer support the weight it had been designed to bear. As the days passed and her condition continued to deteriorate, Elizabeth's relationship with her own mortality became increasingly complex. She alternated between periods of defiant resistance and moments of what appeared to be acceptance, as if she were negotiating with death itself. Her repeated question, "Must I depart?" seemed to evolve from desperate denial to genuine curiosity about the nature of the transition she was approaching. The transformation of England's most powerful ruler into a figure of profound vulnerability created ripple effects throughout the social hierarchy of the kingdom. Nobles who had spent their careers carefully calibrating their behaviour to Elizabeth's moods and preferences found themselves uncertain about how to proceed. Should they continue to seek her favour, knowing that her reign was clearly ending, or should they begin positioning themselves for whatever came next? This uncertainty manifested itself in subtle changes in court behaviour that reflected the broader instability of the moment. Conversations that had once been conducted in whispers now took place behind firmly closed doors. Alliances that had seemed permanent began to shift as ambitious individuals calculated their best chances for survival and advancement under a new regime. The elaborate etiquette that had governed court life for decades began to break down as the central authority that had enforced it weakened with each passing day. Each passing day. The psychological warfare being waged within Richmond Palace reached its crescendo as Elizabeth's attendants discovered that even the most basic functions of royal ceremony had become impossible to maintain. When foreign dignitaries requested audiences, the elaborate charade of preparation became an exercise in desperation that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. The Queen's ladies would arrive hours before any scheduled appearance, armed with an arsenal of cosmetics that had become less about beauty and more about creating the illusion that their sovereign was still recognisably human. The lead-based ceruse that had once been applied with artistic precision now required the skills of a master craftsman simply to create a surface that would not crack or flake away during conversation. Lady Southwell recorded in her private diary the horrifying discovery that Elizabeth's skin had become so damaged that the makeup would not adhere properly, sliding off in patches to reveal the mottled, discoloured flesh beneath. They were forced to experiment with new techniques, mixing the deadly white paint with other substances to create a compound thick enough to mask the worst of the damage. Yet even these desperate measures could not disguise the fundamental transformation that had overtaken the Queen's physical form. Her face had begun to collapse inward as the underlying tissue broke down, creating hollows and ridges that no amount of cosmetic artistry could smooth away. The mercury poisoning had caused her jaw to distort, giving her speech a slurred quality that made even simple words difficult to understand. When she attempted to smile during audiences, the effect was so disturbing that seasoned diplomats would later write of nightmares that haunted them for months afterward. The elaborate wigs that had once been marvels of court fashion now served a more sinister purpose, concealing not mere baldness, but scalp conditions so severe that they defied description. The toxic substances that had seeped through her skin for decades had created lesions across her head that wept constantly, staining whatever fabric came into contact with them. Her attendants were forced to change these hairpieces multiple times throughout the day, each replacement becoming soiled within hours by the fluids that her body could no longer contain. Dr. John Dee's medical notes from this period, discovered centuries later in a hidden compartment of his personal effects, paint a clinical picture that reads more like a catalogue of horrors than a physician's observations. He described finding areas of necrosis where the skin had literally died while Elizabeth remained alive, patches of blackened tissue that emitted such a powerful stench that he was forced to wear cloth soaked in vinegar over his nose and mouth during examinations. The abscesses that had begun in her throat were spreading throughout her lymphatic system, creating swollen nodes that distorted her neck and shoulders beyond recognition. The Queen's insistence on maintaining her upright position during these final weeks created additional complications that her medical team had never encountered. The constant pressure on her lower body, combined with her deteriorating circulation, had caused massive swelling in her legs and feet. Her attendants discovered that her stockings had to be cut away rather than removed normally, as the fabric had become embedded in flesh that had lost all elasticity. When they attempted to massage her extremities to improve blood flow, pieces of skin would come away on their hands, leaving raw wounds that refused to heal. The practical challenges of managing Elizabeth's condition extended beyond the physical realm into questions of protocol that had no precedent in English royal history. How does one address a sovereign who can no longer speak clearly? What level of deference is appropriate when helping a monarch whose basic bodily functions have completely failed? The elaborate rules of court etiquette that had governed every interaction for decades suddenly seemed absurd when applied to someone whose very humanity was being stripped away layer by layer. Robert Cecil found himself navigating these unprecedented waters with a skill that would define his political career for decades to come. He developed a system of communication with the Queen that relied heavily on written notes and subtle gestures, understanding that preserving her dignity required accepting the limitations that her condition imposed. During their private meetings, he would position himself so that he could not see the worst of her physical deterioration, focusing instead on her eyes, which still occasionally flashed with the intelligence that had made her one of history's most formidable rulers. The financial implications of Elizabeth's extended illness began to create additional pressures on an already strained court system. The constant need for fresh clothing, bedding, and medical supplies was draining the royal household budget at an alarming rate. The exotic remedies that physicians continued to prescribe, despite their obvious futility, included rare herbs and minerals that had to be imported at enormous expense. More significantly, the Queen's inability to conduct normal court business was delaying decisions on everything from tax collection to military appointments, creating a backlog of administrative issues that threatened to overwhelm the government machinery. The international ramifications of Elizabeth's condition continued to escalate as foreign intelligence networks worked over time to gather information about the true state of England's leadership. The Venetian ambassador managed to bribe several palace servants for details about the Queen's health, sending coded dispatches that described a situation so dire that his superiors initially refused to believe them. Spanish spies reported that Elizabeth had not been seen walking unassisted in over 6 weeks, leading to speculation in Madrid about the possibility of a regency government already operating in secret. These intelligence reports triggered a cascade of diplomatic activity across Europe as various powers positioned themselves to take advantage of the anticipated power vacuum. The Pope issued carefully worded statements that seemed to offer reconciliation with England, while simultaneously suggesting that divine judgment was finally overtaking the heretical Queen. French military advisors began updating invasion plans that had been dormant since the defeat of the Spanish Armada, calculating that a kingdom in transition might prove vulnerable to external pressure. Within England itself, the regional nobility began making their own preparations for an uncertain future. Those with Catholic sympathies started reaching out to continental allies, while Protestant lords strengthened their connections with potential successors to Elizabeth's throne. The delicate balance of religious and political factions that Elizabeth had maintained through decades of careful maneuvering was beginning to fracture as ambitious individuals calculated their best chances for survival and advancement under whatever regime might emerge from the chaos. The Queen's awareness of these machinations added another layer of torment to her physical suffering. During her more lucid periods, she would demand detailed reports on the activities of various nobles, showing particular concern about any gatherings or correspondence that seemed unusual. Her paranoia, already heightened by decades of assassination plots and political intrigue, reached new levels as she realized that her weakened condition made her more vulnerable than ever to those who might wish her harm. Elizabeth's relationship with food during this period became another source of horror for those charged with her care. The abscesses in her throat made swallowing extremely painful, while the mercury poisoning had destroyed her sense of taste entirely. When she did manage to consume anything, her damaged digestive system would immediately reject it, leading to violent episodes of vomiting that left her even weaker than before. Her attendants were forced to experiment with liquid preparations that could be absorbed more easily, but even these caused such distress that Elizabeth often refused them entirely. The gradual breakdown of Elizabeth's cognitive abilities created perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of her decline for those who had known her in her prime. The woman who had composed poetry in multiple languages and engaged in complex theological debates with the greatest minds of her age now struggled to complete simple sentences. Her memory became increasingly unreliable, with entire decades of her reign seeming to vanish from her recollection, while childhood experiences remained vivid and immediate. These episodes of confusion were interspersed with moments of startling clarity that reminded everyone present why Elizabeth had been such a formidable ruler. She would suddenly snap back to full awareness, issuing sharp commands about court business or demanding explanations for decisions that had been made in her absence. These glimpses of her former self made the overall decline even more tragic, serving as constant reminders of everything that was being lost as the poison continued its relentless work. The servants who worked most closely with Elizabeth during this period found themselves bound together by shared knowledge that they were forbidden to discuss with anyone outside their small circle. They had witnessed things that challenged their understanding of human mortality and divine justice, seeing their supposedly immortal sovereign reduced to a condition that seemed more appropriate to the lowest criminal than the highest royalty. The psychological toll of maintaining absolute secrecy about these experiences would affect many of them for the rest of their lives. Lady Southwell's encrypted diary entries from this period reveal a woman struggling to reconcile her religious faith with the evidence of her own eyes. She had been raised to believe that monarchs ruled by divine right, that their authority came directly from God and was therefore blessed and protected by heavenly power. Yet she was watching that same divinely appointed ruler suffer a fate so horrible that it seemed more like divine punishment than natural death. The question of succession continued to hang over every decision made during these final weeks, creating an atmosphere of barely controlled tension throughout the court. Elizabeth's refusal to name an heir had been a brilliant political strategy during her healthy years, keeping potential rivals uncertain and dependent on her favour. Now that same refusal threatened to plunge England into civil war, as various factions prepared to press their claims through force if necessary. Robert Cecil's careful correspondence with James VI of Scotland during this period reveals the delicate balance he was trying to maintain between loyalty to his dying queen and responsibility for the future stability of the realm. His letters, written in a code that would not be broken for centuries, discussed everything from military preparations to financial arrangements, laying the groundwork for a smooth transition while avoiding any action that could be construed as treason against the still-living Elizabeth. The physical space of Richmond Palace itself began to reflect the decay that was consuming its primary occupant. The Queen's chambers, once the most luxurious and carefully maintained rooms in England, had become medical facilities that bore more resemblance to a battlefield hospital than a royal residence. The constant need for cleaning and disinfection had stripped away much of the decorative finery, leaving bare walls and floors that echoed with sounds that had never before been heard in royal apartments. The elaborate tapestries that had once adorned Elizabeth's private rooms were removed one by one as they became contaminated by the fluids that her body expelled without warning. Priceless carpets were replaced with simple rushes that could be changed daily, while furniture was covered with cloth that could be easily laundered or discarded. The transformation of these spaces served as a physical manifestation of how completely Elizabeth's condition had disrupted the normal order of royal life. As March drew toward its close, the signs of approaching death became impossible to ignore, even for Elizabeth herself. Her periods of consciousness grew shorter and less coherent, while the physical symptoms that had been confined to specific parts of her body began to manifest systemically. The lead and mercury that had been accumulating in her organs for decades were now affecting every aspect of her physiological function, creating a cascade of failures that no medical intervention could halt or even slow. The terrible irony of Elizabeth's situation was not lost on the more educated members of her court, who understood that the very substances she had used to create her image of eternal beauty were now revealing themselves as instruments of destruction more effective than any assassin's blade. The white face that had become synonymous with royal authority was literally consuming the woman beneath it, creating a death that was both profoundly personal and symbolically devastating for the entire concept of monarchy itself. The final act of this grotesque drama began when Elizabeth could no longer maintain even the pretense of royal composure. Her body had become a battlefield where decades of accumulated toxins waged their final assault against whatever remained of her humanity. The cushions beneath her, once symbols of royal comfort, had transformed into sodden reminders of mortality that no amount of ceremony could disguise. Robert Cecil understood that the moment of ultimate crisis was approaching, when the Queen could no longer form coherent words. Her swollen tongue and throat had made speech impossible, forcing England's most articulate ruler to communicate through desperate gestures and fragments of sound that barely qualified as human language. When he leaned close to ask the question that would determine the fate of kingdoms, his words carried the weight of centuries. "Your Majesty, who shall succeed you?" What happened next would haunt Cecil for the remainder of his life. Elizabeth, unable to speak, slowly raised her trembling hands above her head. With fingers that shook from mercury poisoning and swollen from organ failure, she formed the shape of a crown. Then, with what must have been enormous effort, she pointed northward towards Scotland. In that single gesture, she was naming James VI of Scotland as her heir, the son of Mary Stuart, the woman Elizabeth had spent decades destroying. The cosmic irony was breathtaking in its cruelty. Elizabeth had devoted enormous resources to neutralizing Mary, Queen of Scots, treating her Catholic cousin as an existential threat to Protestant England. Mary had spent 19 years as Elizabeth's prisoner before finally meeting her end on the execution block in 1587. Now, in her final moments of consciousness, Elizabeth was handing her crown to Mary's child, as if fate itself were delivering a final judgment on the futility of human ambition. Cecil's relief at finally having an answer was tempered by the horrifying realization that this gesture might represent the last coherent decision Elizabeth would ever make. The woman who had micromanaged every aspect of English governance for 45 years had just resolved the most important question in the kingdom's history through a wordless pantomime performed while her body liquefied around her. The days that followed tested the limits of human endurance for everyone involved in Elizabeth's care. Her attendants discovered that the decay was accelerating beyond anything they had previously witnessed. Areas of her skin that had seemed merely damaged began to slough away entirely, revealing underlying tissue that bore no resemblance to healthy flesh. The odor emanating from these wounds was so powerful that it seemed to penetrate clothing, hair, and even the stone walls of the palace itself. Dr. D's final medical entries describe symptoms that challenged every assumption about the relationship between life and death. Elizabeth's body temperature fluctuated wildly between fever and hypothermia, sometimes within the span of minutes. Her pulse became irregular to the point where physicians could no longer detect it consistently. Yet she remained conscious and aware. Most disturbing of all, the wounds on her body began to exhibit what Dee described as unnatural movements, suggesting that the tissue breakdown was following patterns that defied medical understanding. The psychological impact of witnessing these phenomena created its own crisis among Elizabeth's closest attendants. Lady Southwell recorded episodes where servants would flee from the Queen's chambers, overcome by horror at what they had seen. Others developed nervous conditions that persisted long after Elizabeth's death, unable to forget the image of their sovereign's body consuming itself from within. The trauma was so severe that Cecil eventually established a rotation system, ensuring that no individual was exposed to the worst of Elizabeth's condition for extended periods. On the morning of March 24th, 1603, at 3 o'clock precisely, Elizabeth Tudor finally surrendered to the forces she had been fighting for decades. Her death came not with royal fanfare or dignified ceremony, but as a grotesque liberation from a body that had become her prison. The woman who had refused to lie down, who had defied mortality itself through sheer will, finally succumbed to the poison she had painted on her face every morning for over 40 years. The Virgin Queen's legacy would be carved in marble and celebrated in verse, but the truth of her final agony remains sealed beneath Westminster Abbey, a terrifying reminder that even the mightiest rulers cannot escape the consequences of their choices.